Okay, guys, so let's start our brand new class here, and we're going to continue to try and improve our first person even more, adding new features and abilities to it. So now we're going to include the zoom function to the character, and this will help us create more realism so that when we press play, there'll be the ability to press a button that will trigger the zoom function. Okay, so we can zoom in and focus on something. And this focus option is similar to like the autofocus function. Sometimes you see it on cameras, even on a mobile phone these days. It comes with autofocus. So that's something we'll do. So let's show you how to do this step by step. Now we'll see the zoom function in free classes, and then we'll have the option to create the interaction for the character, and finally create the autofocus. But in this class, we'll only focus on the zoom. So what I did here was to create a scene, and I inserted some objects so that the character could interact with them. And I created a cine camera actor, okay? A cinematic camera. So we should probably talk a little bit about the function before, and later we'll use it with the character. So as I said, I've created this camera in our scene, and the camera now is focusing or pointing in the direction of our main object. So here we can jump into the camera, and basically as we view in the camera, we can see that it's using the Unreal standard settings with the camera. I haven't changed anything else, and it's pointing in the direction of the sphere, the red sphere. So let's have a look at some of the settings and just go through what we can potentially adjust. You probably already know some of the settings from the ArcViz photorealism course, but let's just remind you of what they are. So first we have the current focal length parameter, and that works like the camera lens in a DSLR camera. So we have low values here, and we can adjust them to this, so they're smaller, and as we go lower, it opens the view, okay? Almost as if it's switching lenses. The more you increase it, the more it closes the focus, so to say, okay? So it opens and closes the lens. And that can work almost like a zoom, can't it? Now, what we'll need to do, of course, if we were going to use that, would be we need to animate that feature. Well, we'll keep it as standard now for our character. And then when the zoom key is not pressed, it's going to come back to the standard position, okay? And when we activate it, we'll use this parameter to increase its zoom or increase the focal length. So it's as simple as that, really. Quite simple. So are you ready? Well, let's do it. First, let's set up the camera just how we like it to be. And of course, it's up to you to decide the settings that you want for your specific project. I'll use what I normally apply, and the settings that I like to use in these sorts of projects. So first of all, here I like to use a value of 13 as the lens, so I have a wider view. And here I use an aperture of 6. To change that to 6. There we go. And if we increase it, see that? That's how it works, okay? So what are these settings that we're adjusting? Well, they're related to each other, basically. The three parameters here that we're going to be using a lot within our camera: the current focal length, the current aperture, and the manual focus distance. They're the main ones we'll use. So if I'm closer and increase this value and then reduce this other one, you can see that the image is a little blurry, isn't it? So it's going to adjust its focal point when you adjust the value here, okay? And the objects become in focus or out of focus. We have a maximum of 22 and a minimum of 1.2 here. So in 22, any focus that I set here won't be blurry because of the aperture, as it's the highest possible value. In case you want to view it differently, from a different length, and never lose the focus, you can adjust that. So basically here you can edit the focus of the lens. And you can adjust the focal distance, okay, which is all driven from the camera lens as well. Cool. So this is nice, a really nice effect to adjust for ArcViz experiences. It looks good, especially when we focus on objects and the background becomes slightly more blurry. It's quite a nice feature for an ArcViz experience, and we'll be adding that to our character. To make sure it works, we'll start with focusing on the zoom. We'll also control the aperture to make things look a little bit more blurry around the background, and we'll play with these values, we'll animate them, and then we can guarantee that if they work, cool, we can move on to focusing on specific objects. And if you look at it now, you can see that there's this blur here, right? And the background is in focus, but the sphere isn't. So the ideal thing for us would be to have the focus on the sphere, right? And then to have the background blurred. So to make sure that that is happening, the parameter or the setting that determines where the focus stays is the manual focus distance. So it's this setting here. So the standard for Unreal is 10,000. We just need to decrease that value because we're not that far away from this object. You can see as I decrease it, the focus is adjusting, isn't it? It's getting more sharp. Nice. So it detects the object that you want to focus on and adjusts the focus distance. And with this, we can also adjust the aperture. And we're using a low aperture here, and the background is blurry, right? Whilst it's focusing on the object that we're interested in. Now, if I increase it, it focuses on the background, objects at the back, and it blurs the one in the front. And if I decrease it, it focuses on the object that I want and blurs the background. Okay, so the opposite basically. So this is what we're going to be doing when we animate these three different factors. And these are parameters to guarantee the focus effect is working. But in this class, we'll only apply the focus parameter, okay? So let's begin with our focus. So this camera is here just as an example in our scene. It's not going to be our blueprint, but it's just for helping us to see visually what's going on. But let's apply this to our first person. Okay, so the first person here is open. Let's start to implement this zoom feature. So where do we start? Well, first, we need to think about applying the simple zoom. So the first thing we need to do is deciding which buttons we press to kick off the event, to start the event, okay? And it can either be on the keyboard or on the mouse. The most common way to do it is with the mouse. So let's choose the right button of our mouse for the zoom function. So how do we do that? Well, we'll do this in project settings, like we programmed all the other buttons. And I'll go down to input. And this is where we put the functions, isn't it? As we did before. So it's either going to be true or false, on or off. So I can add it in this section here. I'll name it zoom and select the right mouse button. There we go. Perfect. So that helps me then to be able to be aware that that's now programmed in, and I can click this or select this from my event graph. The second step here is to put the event here. So we need to click here. We search for zoom. And we got that down as our action mapping. There's nothing new here. We've done all this before, haven't we? So we're going to create a zoom effect from this action. So remember the questions that we asked ourselves: when, who, and what. So when am I going to press this? Who? Well, the who's the camera. Okay, the camera's going to be zooming in. And we also need to be thinking about the effect that we want to be focusing on, which is the focal length. That's the effect from here. Okay, so we'll set it as default to begin with, and then we'll think about increasing the distance. So let's put all this theory together and start making it, right? Let's check my camera settings here in the details panel. Now it's already set up. So here's the pattern that we normally use, or the values. We'll work with a focal length of 13, the aperture of 6, and this is going to be our standard, or what it looks like without the zoom function. And we also use the manual focus method. And we're going to keep it at a distance of 350 centimeters for our focus distance, okay, or 3.5 meters. And then it's important to think about that because that's our starting point, our normal distance that we are able to focus on things without the zoom. And then we're going to be making sure that the settings for no zoom are just as we want them. And then we're going to think about the settings we want for when we're zoomed in. Okay. Interior scenes are great for having a distance of 350. And especially with an aperture set as we have, it will work nicely. So they're the settings I tend to use for the Cine camera. And that's independent from the zoom button being pressed or not. But because we've got these as our standard settings, we'll use them too. So what I have to do here is to change our focus. So I need to pull this and type focal length. There we go. Now we won't get this because we want to alter it. So we need to choose set current focal length. Okay, so we can determine what it is. I'll connect these two as usual. And the parameter that we'll use here, well, it needs to be tested, doesn't it? So here we go. Let's just put in, let's think about this. Let's use a value of 40. Okay, so we're going to increase this parameter from 13 to 40 and we'll test it. It's nice. It's nice to keep doing a test to make sure that you're happy with how it's looking. Okay, so here we go. So here's the object. I'm going to press the zoom button with the right mouse button on the mouse. Let's do it again. Let's set the release button as well, because at the moment it's just working when we got it pressed. So we've made a copy of the set, plug the target in, and return to released. There we go. So we should be able to press and unpress now. So we zoom in with the right mouse button and unpress it, it zooms out. Okay, see that? Nice. So it's working. Similar to the crouch feature we did before, it's instant, isn't it? It's either on or off. So we can adjust the variation later on in making it a bit more smooth. But at least at this stage, we know that the zoom function is working. And we're getting the hang of using the action keys, aren't we? And the triggers attached to different buttons on the mouse or the keyboard. So it starts to zoom in from the initial position to the zoomed in setting. And we can obviously adjust these settings if we want, now that we know how it all works. So to create the effects of the variation in time, so it's not an instant jump to the new position, we use a timeline, just as we've used before. We've got timeline and we'll call it zoom. And there we go. And let's just organize things so it looks a bit more organized visually. Okay, so we have a zoom timeline here. Let's open up the float and we'll create the curve. So we need to create a curve that will cause the effect of the smooth motion of our camera focus. So it's like a smooth zooming in to what we want to focus on. I'll rename the curve as focal length for now, just to make it easier to see what we're doing. Okay. I like to work with the time of 0.5 seconds because that's pretty fast, isn't it? Half a second. It doesn't take too long. and it's a bit more realistic at that time. Okay, so let's just put that here, the keyframe. Create a key effect at 0 and another one at half a second. There we go. And let's just analyze this a little bit. So we have to create an effect that goes from the value of 13 here all the way to 40, right? So how do we do this? Well, to create the effect we want, since we're not starting at 0, whenever we work with the timeline, to avoid the problems that we had in the other classes that we had to solve, we need to get the relative position, don't we? Remember? Otherwise, it's going to just jump to 0, which is not what we want. So we either get the relative position or set the curve to the value that we are starting from. So the value I want to change is, rather than 0, I want it to use any number, the number of where the relative number. So if it starts at 0, that's okay. You can multiply it directly on the curve, but just be careful with doing it that way, as we saw before. Now, in this case, we're going from 13 to 40, and it doesn't start at 0. So therefore, let's do it directly here in the timeline, just so it doesn't give that jump back to 0 if we trigger the action. So let's do it here from 13. So let's adjust it to make our curve smooth as well. Put them to automatic, just so there's that smooth movement. Okay, and we'll take the variation from 13 to 40 in half a second like this. Cool. Okay, so for this value, I won't type 40 anymore. I'll just put it straight in there. So it's going to go from 13 to 40. And when I release it, it's going to go back from 40 to 13. So let's press play and see what happens. So we can already see that we have our camera shake swaying the camera. We implemented it in another class, and when I press zoom, I move the camera, and I can continue with my mouse movement and walk as well. It doesn't affect anything else, so that's nice. And we've altered the lens. Nice, so I'm happy with that. So if I press it, it zooms in, I release it, zooms out. So basically, this is the zoom effect, and it's moving smoothly, not so abrupt. But we can make it look better than this. Are you interested in making it better? Well, I am, and I'm going to show you anyway. We can include the effect of the blur that you normally get when you're trying to adjust the focus when you zoom. And this is really going to help the visual appeal and make it more realistic. So we'll add that blur effect to this zoom as well. So how do we do that? Well, we can reproduce this by just checking our camera settings here. So I'm at 13. And let me just put 13 in here. Okay. So let me just focus on make that 13 and 6, was it, for the aperture? Okay. So now the camera matches perfectly the other camera that we have in our character. And the zoom effect that we're creating is increasing until it gets to around 40, right? So as we told it to do that in the blueprint, it's doing it fine, but it doesn't blur because the aperture is set to 6. So what we'll do is reduce the aperture 2, and you'll see how I reduce it and how it loses focus. You see that? So it's not focused anymore. It's not very clear. So let's think about how we can get that to replicate this function in the blueprint. So our focus is at 3.5 meters. So it's all the way back here. Not sure. Okay, let's get that to 350. And now we can see actually I'm 6.5 meters away. So if the focus was at 3.5 meters, maybe it's just not reached the object just yet. So we need to animate the aperture really, so that we can replicate the focus, almost like it's moving close, then not so, the focus hasn't quite reached it, and then and then it does. So that almost like the time it takes to reconfigure, we're going to implement that. So to do this, what do we need to do first? Well, let's just think about the flow in our blueprint. So it's playing the timeline after the events kicked off, and it's setting the focal length values. So that's the logic that we're using at the moment. So with that in mind, when I press it, it runs this timeline, it executes the aperture effect, and well, that's what we want to do. So how would it do that? So we want to change the value for the camera aperture. So let's go and find that here. Just see if you can follow the logic here. So I already have our cine camera. I can pull it from here, the type aperture. And you see here, it's the same idea. We get set current aperture. Okay. And I'm in this node here, and I can adjust the settings. Same idea as we did before. And we can bring it to a value of, actually from a value of 6. Okay. Or maybe 1.6. Almost the minimum. And then we'll have to perform a variation in time from 6 to 1.6. So therefore, I can't use this timeline because it's only going to do a timeline for 13 to 6. So I need to create another timeline. So I'll do that here. And I'll call it aperture. Okay, if I double click it, it will create the curve again, as we're familiar with, just as we've done before. And we'll use the same distance or same time, half a second. So at the beginning, it won't focus, and then it's going to adjust and then focus all within the same time. So what we have to do is we need to create a curve with a variation from a value of 6 to 1.6. So let's do this in the same way we did with the focus animation. So our time is from 0 to 0.5, and the value we want initially 6. I'll go from 0.5 to 1.6 actually in time. Just reduce it to make it smoother. Perfect. I'll put this here. Oh, I think I forgot to rename the curve actually. Let's name that properly. We call it aperture. That's great. Okay, cool. That's good. So aperture then will link here and here. And now what we're going to do? Well, if I press play, let's see what happens. Okay, once we've connected that in. Yeah, let's see what happens when we press play. Let's compile and play. Okay, so I'm here and I press on the right mouse button. It zooms in. And it blurs the image, doesn't it? So it's executing this timeline at the same time as the other one. Okay, so how am I going to reverse this? So I'd have to think to maybe reverse it here, but I'm not allowed to do it like that, am I? Could I pull it from here? No. Well, that's not going to work either. So I need to do this in a sequence. So because it's in a flow, I can't split the flow. So to solve this kind of problem, we really need to dive into another subject. And maybe this will be a good time to explain it. And this will help us if we get into these problems again. So to avoid showing them one by one and in the end, we can't remember anymore, let me show you now. So these are the nodes that control the flow, the direction of things. So we've already seen and understood them. But what needs to happen here is that when I press the button to run the function, it also needs to run this function. Now, if we're going to do them both at the same time, it's going to cause a problem. They can be ineffective. So there is a node that helps us, which is called sequence. So let's create that here, a sequence. There we go. So it creates a sequence of events. And this is what we're going to do. So let me show you this node. So the sequence here receives the flow, it enters, and then it comes out this side for under then, and then. And you can add as many sequences as you want, okay? And it will run both at the same time. So we can add as many here as we wish just by clicking this add button. Okay, and then we can just remove them now. Okay, so we need to execute the zoom event and then the aperture event. So what does the sequence help us with? Like we said, do more than one thing at once. Not only, or in sequence, so not only does it help us solve this problem, but it also helps us to understand the flow and how we can create even more complex things later down the line. So this is a huge benefit for us, and it stops us from having to have such a long line of different blueprints. It helps us stay organized as well. So we'll see this when we start creating other references to event begin play. But as we said, we don't want long lines, we want to stay organized. So let's use this example of how the sequence works. So that means now we can move this over here, right? We don't need things to be so long. We can keep them more condensed because of the sequencer. So we're going to pull out from here and plug it into the aperture. So when pressing this button, it's going to come here and execute this at the same time as the other animation. And now in reverse, we can add in another sequence here. And this sequence can be for the reverse, okay? So when I release the key, I'm going to perform this action and this one as well at the same time. There we go. So to execute both functions at the same time, we can now do it thanks to the sequence. So let's see this in practice. I zoom in and it's blurry, and zoom out and it's changing the aperture at the same time. Cool. If I get a little closer, try and match the distance, look at that. Because I know my focus distance is 3.5 meters away, I've almost got into that position, haven't I? 3.5 meters away, and I zoom in. Beautiful. And now hopefully you can see how things in the background are blurred as well. When I release it, of course, it goes back to normal. So far so good, right? But now our challenge is to zoom in on any object and make sure that the object we zoom in on remains the focus. And that's all to do with the autofocus, okay? So the abilities for the camera to pick up on whichever object we're looking at and focus on that. Because at the moment, I have no way of telling whether I'm exactly 3.5 meters away, and someone who's using this for the first time isn't going to know that my focal distance is 3.5 meters, are they? So it's more helpful to be able to have that feature of autofocus so that we can look at anything, no matter the distance, and whichever one is in front of its view, it will automatically focus on. So it's not dependent or reliant on the distance, okay? So we'll take a look at that in the next video and add another level of realism to our character. Okay, so I'll see you in the next class.